All right, today we're going to be diving into Bitcoin and the likelihood of a super cycle. Is that actually what we're starting to experience right now within the markets? We'll also talk with an expert on this. I think you guys are going to love it. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back into Tech Path. Joining me today, of course, is Mr. Scott Melker coming over from Wolf of All Streets. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Excellent. So, Scott, let's get into a few things here. I want to go into a handful of tweets and kind of get your opinion in terms of the current cycle that we're in right now, because I think a lot of this, some people still may believe that, we entered the bull run almost with a slight lull into it. Still people doubting that whether or not we truly had a bull run in front of us. Now, of course, things are a little bit different, but this is a good example of one of the things. This is kind of the Wall Street cheat sheet psychology of a market cycle. You've seen this before, and of course, the big deal is the disbelief area that we've kind of surpassed at this point and now starting to move in it. As we start to really start to experience some market positions, I think, across all of these crypto markets right now, where do you think we are in the current cycle as it is right now in comparison to some maybe you're having?
I would have put it at that rise right there between disbelief and hope. If I had to, if you take a look at that chart, especially if we believe in the 4-year cycle for crypto, we're very, very early for that parabolic run that comes from hope and into optimism. So obviously that chart is just a guide. It doesn't mean that every market will follow it. But I think conceptually that it does make a lot of sense. Right now, I think once we got to 38,000, started pushing to 42, of course, pushing 44 at the moment, which is a bit surprising, I think. I think now we're starting to see the headlines again. We're starting to get a few phone calls from the friends from high school asking if it's time to look at Bitcoin again. It was really dead silent up until that point, even for me. And I think I talk about Bitcoin more often than most. So I really just think that this is kind of the beginning of the cycle. That doesn't mean there won't be huge retracements. We won't see those 30, 40% painful dips that make people believe that we're going back down to new lows. But right now, when you bottomed at sub 16,000 and you're pushing 44, it's just absurd to call it a bear market bounce, right? And even the case to some degree with equities. I mean, we've just seen things continue to rip throughout, and it's hard. You have to really have cognitive dissonance at this point to think that everything is looking extremely bearish.
This was a statement, I think this came in from Jeff Safert. Bloomberg says that this is a start of a fresh crypto super cycle, one that could push Bitcoin above 500K. I mean, again, we've heard these kind of outlandish numbers before when really on the last cycle when everybody was really kind of looking at that 100K mark. And obviously we topped out at 69. But what's your opinion on this one? Do you feel that this particular cycle with where we are both globally is different, or institutional finance, anything playing different that really makes you think?
I mean, I think we have different narratives, but I very seriously doubt that we'll have a significantly different cycle, right? You can prove it to me if I see it, but we've had a pretty solid history of the way that markets operate. I think the very nature of a super cycle is utter nonsense. We saw it a few years ago. We talked about how it was going to go straight to 250 or 500,000. Nothing could stop it. Charts didn't matter. Liquidity didn't matter. Global markets didn't matter because Bitcoin had reducing supply and demand was up and it was going to go straight to $1 million, right? We've heard it every single cycle and it never happens because humans are going to human and someone's going to take advantage of those that believe in those cycles to sell into them and make profit. I believe we get another massive cycle, certainly well into 6 figures. I don't even think that the idea of 500,000 is hyperbolic by any stretch. Maybe that takes a cycle or two. I don't know if we'll get there this cycle. But the idea that of the super cycle is that we will defy all logic, defy all history. This time is different, new paradigm. You look at that Wall Street cheat sheet, that's the very definition of that euphoria phase that you see at the top. And hearing people talk like that already gives me more pause than excitement, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I look at it this way, and again, this is a scenario that we're starting to see for the first time, even though in the last cycle in 2021, we saw a lot of traditional finance commentary making it into crypto in general. Now we see Wall Street really at the table. When Wall Street comes to the table, along comes, traditional finance media. With that being the case, and of course, you and I both understand this market I think we feel like we have a better pulse on the industry than what mainstream media does. So these kind of statements right here, because we are seeing this more and more from pretty significant reputation out there in the finance industry. Why would you see or think that we would see those kinds of crazy statements from someone like a Bloomberg?
I think it makes great headlines, right? The minute that we
Clickable.
start to see interest, yeah, I think the minute that we start seeing major interest rolling back into Bitcoin, it becomes a hot topic. You see headlines, Bitcoin breaks 42,000, Bitcoin hits 44,000. Then it's very easy to post these hyperbolic, insane numbers and get a ton of clicks. And we all know that mainstream media is about nothing more than clicks. Nobody's going to remember that they said that if Bitcoin tops at $235,000.
Sure.
Right? Nobody's going to be like, oh, those idiots at Bloomberg in 2023 said 500,000. It's basically a zero risk way to get a ton of attention. I did a show on it this morning on YouTube. You and I are talking about it right now here. Same exact thing. It's a very, very effective tactic. So listen, we've had Wall Street banks making large predictions much more in this cycle than ever before. Standard Chartered famously continues to have $150,000, $200,000 targets. This is the first one I've seen as big as 500,000, but I do think that we're going to continue, more importantly, to see Wall Street beating the narrative of Bitcoin as an investable asset and crypto as an investable asset class in general. And that's what we want, right? You don't get Larry Fink on TV saying that crypto is a flight to quality unless he has a vested interest in doing so. He's probably one of the top 5 most powerful people on the planet. He runs BlackRock, and he could be talking about literally anything on TV. And if he's talking his book and his book is Bitcoin, it's time to really pay attention regardless of what your ridiculous price targets are.
All right, with that being the statement, again, this is Jeff Seyffert from Bloomberg coming in on the updates of the ETF filings. S1 prospectuses pouring in. So you probably saw this, amendments coming in last night. This is all, again, good signs because that means there's a lot of dialogue going in between the SEC. When you think about where the SEC is right now and with what's happening with the ETF filings, does this still give you pretty much the same conviction that you've had for some time about we're going to see it and it's probably going to come in January?
I think so. I speak with Eric Balchunas and James Seyffert, whose tweet you just showed, quite often on my channels. I count them almost as friends at this point because I harass them so much about their targets and percentages. And we all know that they're pricing in a 90% chance of an approval by January 10th and probably a sweeping approval of multiple Bitcoin spot ETFs, which, when you think about how exciting that is, that means because they are likely to approve all of them at once, that we're going to get this massive marketing war that effectively just becomes an advertising campaign for Bitcoin. Because 10 of them can't secure meaningful AUM and win in this market, it'll probably be one and then scraps for everybody else. Obviously, if I had to bet, I would bet on that being BlackRock. I believe they probably have the AUM already lined up. They're not going to launch with a whimper. If they are going to get approved, and they likely know that they are based on all the dialogue you just discussed, I have a feeling that they're lining up that marketing and behind the scenes are already getting that AUM committed to their ETF. But either way, yes, I think the odds are very strong because of the dialogue that you talked about as well. I mean, the SEC in the past just kicked the can down the road, delay, reject. Right? They had the 240-day period. It ended in a rejection. There was no commentary, no resources spent. Now they're spending their time, money, and their, the few people they have working there that can be focused on other things, actually focusing on this, interacting directly. You probably recently last week saw that BlackRock had a meeting at the SEC, 10 members of BlackRock, this very long deck, very involved on how the operating procedures, very much deep in the weeds of how these ETFs could look. They're not doing that just for fun, right? So I think that all indications point to these approvals. And frankly, I think that this is a really good face-saving measure for Gary Gensler. They've obviously taken a beating against the crypto industry of late. When it seemed like this was going to be a very dismal time for crypto, we continue to seemingly win. But I think they can approve a Bitcoin spot ETF and still take that aggressive tactic towards everything else in the industry, right? Say, listen, we delayed this until it was the big names like the Fidelities and the BlackRocks, the people that we trust, your trusted names. We protected you by not allowing smaller players to have control of this industry. We brought in the trusted Wall Street participants. Here you go. Throw us a bone. And then I doubt we get much more after that.
Well, I think a lot of litigation obviously is in the, kind of in the hunt as to whether or not the SEC will continue its overreach in terms of powers, which is really going to be the longer cycle of understanding how it could adjust, or I should say affect what's going to happen within the rest of the crypto, markets in general, especially around blockchain. Obviously, we just saw Robinhood, Coinbase both going aggressively into the UK markets, most likely going to see some pretty major, I think, impact in terms of the type of investors that will jump into that. So it does bring me to the point of how investors will start to migrate. And if you look at Hashdex, of course, one of the, let me kind of go back to that. Hashdex, one of the Bitcoin ETFs that we're talking about. Within the article, there was a note here, and it says they think that U.S. investors will gain access around second quarter, possibly. And then they also expected an Ether ETF to potentially follow suit. What is your thoughts on an ETH ETF and whether or not that's a reality in 2024?
Well, first of all, on the Bitcoin spot ETF, I think it's important to understand the nuance. We could see those 19B4s approved by January 10th, but those S1s are a separate approval that's required. Right. So they could not necessarily launch right on January 10th, which would align very well with what Hashdex is saying here about second quarter. I think we all know it's going to take a bit of time. It's going to depend on how much hype there is in the media around what kind of AUM we see flowing in. As for an Ethereum spot ETF, I do think it's inevitable and next, but I'm not sure that it's inevitable and next quickly. Certainly with Gary Gensler at the helm, we've never even been able to get him to qualify whether Ethereum is a security or not, even when he's testifying in front of Congress. So I think that we're going to probably see a long delay period after the Bitcoin spot ETF where they approve this. Like I said, throw us the bone and then sit back and wait and see what happens. So I do think it's inevitable, but I don't think that it's going to happen quickly. I could be completely wrong, but I think it could even take regime change at the very top, new administration in power, Congress and Senate going to one side for us to really see that kind of movement. We might even need to see Gary Gensler replaced or out at the SEC before we start getting much movement, I think, beyond Bitcoin. And listen, from the very beginning, Gary Gensler taught blockchain at MIT. Mm-hmm. We all know the stories that he was supposed to be a Bitcoiner, but clearly has a view on Bitcoin being one thing and everything else being another. And I think that, gun to his head, if the cameras weren't on, he would say, Ethereum's a security and I don't want to approve this thing. So I just think it's a bigger stretch.
Yeah, there's been a couple of lawsuits, though, if you go back to even the Chevron scenario, where we could see the overreach starting to play into this. There was a recent insider trading and fraud charge that was to a trader that has now got a Supreme Court, I believe it was a Supreme Court win, so to speak, because remember that the SEC has kind of that kangaroo court where they can go after these kinds of scenarios, make their adjustments, and do all of their own infrastructure. Congress granted them that right, and now the courts have said, okay, that's not necessarily the case. Everybody should get a trial, in reference to a jury trial. Yeah, that's kind of one of those things. So maybe we're finally getting to that point where Congress has said, okay, we're getting kind of our pants pulled down here, and they do make some swift moves. I'm going to play a clip for you toward the end of the show. So everybody that's watching this right now, hang around for that, because I think it's a pretty big clip in reference to, and it's about Tom Emmer and his adjustment and what his assessment is with the SEC. Before we get there, I want to go over here and take a look at a couple of things. Solana starting to make its way onto the mainstream media stage. We haven't seen Solana shown with Bitcoin and Ethereum much, and now it's starting to be shown on CNBC, etc. When you look at that and you think about some of the blue chips, we'll call them, altcoins out there, whether it's a Solana, an Avalanche, a Cardano, whatever it might be, but the fact that we have those coming on, how much of a role do you think they'll play in this next bull run?
I think they'll be significant. I think that the early indications here, obviously, that Solana could be a leader into the next bull market, not only because the price has gone up, but because the excitement around development, the excitement around Fire Dancer, which will make, transactions faster and cheaper and more secure in theory. It truly is the first time that I think a lot of people are looking at a blockchain and saying, maybe this thing can literally do all of it. Right. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that it necessarily can. I have my questions, certainly, but narrative drives price and narrative drives bull markets. And I think that Solana is going to be a major narrative throughout, right? Everything that's being built on it, all of the side projects, NFTs, gaming, all of these things, we're going to see those narratives on Solana. But I would not count Ethereum out or dead. In fact, I think the fact that Ethereum has been lagging so much right now is an opportunity and not a condemnation, right? I don't think that it's an indictment of anything happening in Ethereum. I think it's just lagging and a chance to really get in somewhat early, to be quite frank. I'm pretty bullish on the idea of Ethereum here, especially, like you said, with the Ethereum spot ETF being on the docket. So it could take a little time, but I think that each cycle we're going to see new layer ones, the new shiny thing, take some market share from the bigger players. If you take a look from 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even 2 years ago, what the top 10 projects were, besides Bitcoin and Ethereum, it tends to look very different who holds those 3 through 10 spots, right? It's just an inevitable part of these cycles. A lot of things make it into the top 10 by market cap only based on hype and not based on anything fundamental, just because they sort of catch that virality and get pumped to the moon, as we say in the space. But I don't think that that necessarily means that they're going to be the most valuable or the winners in the next cycle. So I think we're going to see quite a few layer ones sort of break through. But Solana does seem to have a very strong and early lead. And I actually hadn't even noticed that it was on the ticker on mainstream media. I do think that's exceptionally meaningful.
Yeah, it's a pretty big statement. To your point right here, ETH starting to clip above 23,000 right now. Looks like it's about breaking through. So ETH may be starting to kind of chase along with where Bitcoin is now at almost 43.5. Avalanche also jumping up a little bit today, which is around 23.50. Not bad. Again, big moves for some of these. One thing I wanted to focus on with Avalanche, with Solana, was this right here. This was a statement from Tully, and one of the co-creators of what Solana has been doing. But the big deal here is around what DeFi could represent with Solana. And much of this is happening within the Phantom wallet. We've seen things like Pyth. If you think about the exchange networks like Allbridge, or even what's happening with Jupiter Exchange, all of those now starting to open up DeFi on a major token that could really expose that network I think in a very positive light. Do you think that it may not draw in the new people into crypto, but I think it may change some of the, kind of the OGs of crypto in terms of their trading cycles? What are your thoughts?
I think slowly a lot of OGs have already mentally made the shift from Ethereum to Solana. I see it all the time, anecdotally, both on Twitter with guests that I have on my show, which is interesting because if you go back even just over a year, Solana was having downtime. It was a dead chain. They were the victims of the FTX collapse. It was going to zero. They were dead. So it's been a pretty major paradigm shift for them to have such interest. Now, listen, if you use Ethereum on a daily basis, you know that it's expensive, it's clunky, it's slow, transactions fail, the network gets congested. Using layer twos and having to bridge the assets is very complex, even though the layer twos do allow it to scale. Then you go on Solana, and listen, maybe there's things technologically wrong with it. Maybe it can go down. I don't think so at this point. But you use it, and the UX UI is much more simple. Things are automatic. You don't need to bridge between trains. You don't need to worry about sending things to the wrong address because you bridge. Mm-hmm. It's just less complicated and more straightforward. And it does seem like a natural evolution of what's been built in previous cycles. Like I said, I think Ethereum figures a lot of these things out as well. And I think that there's a very hardcore community that believes deeply in Ethereum, and they believe that it will be the safest and most secure regardless. I don't think it's going anywhere. But I think that Tully is right in what he's saying there. And so if TVL starts to flow into Solana, I think we could see a huge explosion of DeFi on that chain. But again, I think we'll see an explosion at various levels of DeFi on all these chains, and NFTs on all these chains, and metaverses on all these chains, and gaming on all these chains. All the narratives we've had in the past are going to come right back around in this cycle, and hopefully will be more mature and ready than they were last time.
Yeah, so that brings up a good point in reference to a potential super cycle, whether it's, if you think about Bitcoin in general, if you look at all of the narratives that have happened from a tech standpoint, for Bitcoin and Ethereum, I would say it's a little bit more of a Wall Street scenario that plays out. With gaming, we are seeing a lot more interest in what we call Web 2 gaming into understanding what blockchain and NFTs could be within game assets. So that's really moved along in terms of down the road quite a bit. They're no longer kicking the can down the road. They're actually giving it a lot more thought. along with what you're talking about in terms of metaverse, we saw the move from Facebook/Meta that has moved dramatically into AR/VR, and obviously Apple right behind them. Most likely we'll see other headset manufacturers. And could we see some, some playouts there in terms of game assets and or just in terms digital assets making their way into the markets? I think this is going to be a big one. With that being the case, Avalanche is one that we're watching very closely. So they just did a statement right here. Project pushing boundaries, tokenization is now launched. And I wanted to get your opinion. We had John Wu on not too long ago talking about tokenized securities. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel that this is far enough along to make it into mainstream finance around the world right now?
I think that if there's something that we've learned from past cycles is the thing that is the narrative of the upcoming bull market, it's usually too early, right? So like I just said with DeFi or metaverse, NFTs, all of these things saw their first sort of basic iteration last cycle and will probably mature in this cycle. Seemingly the big narrative of this cycle is RWA, real world assets, as you said. That gives me pause and makes me think that that's 5 or 6 years away. And we'll see the first iterations of this, but we'll see it mature in the future. That said, I do think that this is very real and arguably the most compelling use case for blockchain technology. How that's investable through tokens will be determined in the future. But factually, everybody talked about BlackRock filing for a Bitcoin spot ETF, right? We saw Larry Fink talk about it in the annual investor letter, which I believe was written last March. The part nobody talks about of that investor letter was when Larry Fink talked about tokenizing every real world asset and putting it on a blockchain, right? Because at the time we were very focused on Bitcoin. It was a bear market and nobody wanted to hear it. But Larry Fink is talking about tokenizing everything and utilizing the blockchain to move these assets. While that's happening, you may have Jamie Dimon out on his Bitcoin is rat poison roadshow, but look at what they do, not what they say. JP Morgan Onyx has launched. They've already settled tokenized money market funds between BlackRock and Barclays, which were moved faster and cheaper and could be used quickly as collateral. That's the future. Franklin Templeton has already tokenized over $350 million worth of T-bills. That's a drop in the bucket for $1 trillion asset manager like Franklin Templeton. But for our market, having $1 billion of T-bills already on the blockchain across all of these platforms, but having Franklin Templeton lead that at 350 million should open your eyes, right? Yes, it's small. Right. It's a small team relative to the size of their entire company, but they're not just using these resources willy-nilly and spending money to build this stuff because they don't believe in it, right? So even if they think there's a viable chance it could happen, they want to be the first to the race, we know that institutions are taking this very seriously, and we're seeing it all the time. JP Morgan and Apollo announcing a similar kind of project. I mean, these are the literal biggest names of institutions on the planet, and every one of them is expending some sort of resources on tokenizing real world assets. So think about all the problems with the way that we do it already, right? We don't need to get into 48-hour settling and what we saw that do to Robinhood and GameStop and the problems that can arise from slow settlement. But just imagine if every stock that you traded went directly when you sold it from you to someone who bought it with almost no fee instantaneously. They held it, they owned it, they could collateralize it 5 seconds after they bought it. It's just a better way. And so I think it's inevitable that that's the way these things will happen in the future. But that requires either the incumbents getting on board or getting replaced. And those are two things that are going to happen very slowly.
So you mentioned replace, because that's the thing that in some scenarios, when you have these tag-along industries, this happened in the early days of the internet. We saw incumbents actually getting replaced because of what was happening from the state of tech in general was moving so quick. So it was kind of dragging through these other things like tokenized securities. And if you look at what Avalanche is doing with Republic Note, my question to you is, could we see a new player maybe come in and say, listen, all right, we know that the Wall Street is already ready, but we have a faster, better horse here, and we're ready to go now. Could they make their way into traditional finance as kind of the new kid, much like Robinhood did with stock trading?
Absolutely. I love John, who you said you've spoken to. I've spoken to him quite a few times, both in person and online, and I've had Emin Gunser as well. I'm a big fan of Avalanche. Now, I think that they always were focused sort of on building private blockchains for institutions from the beginning. So for them to win this space would not be a huge surprise. But what I think is maybe the threat to them, I'm not saying that this is what will happen, But when you see a JP Morgan Onyx, these kind of institutions likely want to own it wholesale themselves, right? So JP Morgan isn't necessarily using a public blockchain or building on someone else's technology. They're just going to do this themselves. And so I think that there's going to be a battle between sort of our popular incumbent blockchains that exist and these companies just building it themselves and doing it completely in a walled garden and cutting out the decentralization and public side of it entirely. So that's why I say I don't know the best way necessarily to invest in real world assets on a blockchain, because I think a lot of it may happen privately between these institutions on their own chains. But listen, whenever anyone asks me, what's going to be the biggest token, the biggest winner of the next cycle, I always laugh and say something we've never heard of.
Exactly.
Right? It's always, there's no selling pressure on a new asset. You don't have people holding these bags down 90% looking for any excuse to sell. You get nothing but hype and buy pressure. So I would anticipate that the winner in a lot of these things is something that's just being built very quietly that hasn't even launched yet, because that seems to be what happens in most cycles.
Interesting you say that. I'll hit on this and just remind everybody, we did a full video on this with, actually with John, but also around tokenized securities. So check that out. I'll drop over some links maybe down in the comments. But this was John talking on Twitter about Republic Note. Again, this is more from a private equity standpoint in terms of getting digital assets to non-accredited investors. So this was gaining exposure. And again, this goes back to the point of, could there be some potential opportunities in there? I want to kind of wrap up on a couple of topics here. Ethereum right now, many people look at this as the technology that really could be the next internet, or at least the birth of the next internet. And if you think about ETH, and in general being the most profitable chain out there still to this date, and you look at Supercycles, if you compare it to something, say, like an Amazon. Amazon, if you look back here, I'll show you a chart from 2015, just to give you an example. If you were an investor in Amazon in 2015, outside of that crazy pump that we saw, of course, right there at almost 1,100%, do you feel like ETH may be in that kind of position where it's just a super cycle and just all the way up, just because of the technology adoption and all that stuff that we're talking about right now?
I don't think so, because I just don't believe in the idea of a super cycle, as I said before. And I do think other things will grab market share, but I think Ethereum's going to $10,000.
Okay.
You know,
all right.
It's like, I'd be pretty happy if it 4X's from here in this next cycle. I could come in and say 2025 and I wouldn't find myself crazy, but other people might. So I hate to give them really.
Would you exit your ETH bag at 10K? Or would you say, no, I think I'll just let this one ride? I'm going to ride through a couple
at 10K, I would take some profit. And this time I'll probably take more profit on everything than I did in the last cycle, including some Bitcoin, as unpopular as that will make me. Bitcoin's sitting at $500,000. I'm going to be hard pressed not to change one out and buy a Rolls Royce or something, right? Because you got to enjoy your life and enjoy your profits. And there'll be plenty of more there. I know you can never sell your Bitcoin. I'll never sell the bulk of it. But I think, yes, there becomes a reasonable time when you want to diversify. The fact is, for a lot of us who are crypto native, and I learned this the hard way the last cycle, like many people, even outside of, Voyager bankruptcy and losing millions there. But when the cycle ends, there'll be plenty of time to buy back, like 3 years, and I don't believe that things only go up. It's never happened in any market. So I don't think that the super cycle idea is going to come to fruition just because it's the thing that I love. But you become way too overweight crypto. If you're one of those people who's 50, 60, 70% in crypto already, and these things 10X, you're going to be 90, 95% crypto. Right. Yeah. And no matter how much you believe in it, you just got to rebalance. Right. And I failed to rebalance some. I took plenty of profit, but I failed to rebalance some in the last market, and I regret it. And I'm not gonna make that mistake again when everybody's telling me that we're going straight to $1 million. Right. And so I do think at 10,000, sure, I'll sell 25% of my Ethereum at maybe 50% at 10,000, and I'll still have way more money in it than I do now. Bitcoin's going to be a hell of a lot harder to sell than any other asset. I'll tell you that. Yeah. Like, it might be one or two here for a luxury purchase that I just want at that price. But I'm not going to sell it in mass to buy stocks,
Okay. There you go. All right. So I'm going to end up on the SEC. Of course, this is just a quick tweet here. Judge threatens to sanction the SEC lawyers for convincing a court to freeze crypto firm assets under false and misleading claims. This is an interesting point. It seems as though, well, not seems, we know that the SEC continues to take a lot of L's, and it appears they've got a couple of bulldogs on them. One is, of course, Mr. Emmer, and we've had Tom on the show before. I want to go to a clip, and I want to play this for you, Scott. So it's a little bit long, but listen, I think you might like it.
When Bill Hinman was the director of the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, he gave a speech on June 14th, 2018, entitled Digital Transactions When Howie Met Gary. Ms. Panik, you reviewed and commented on drafts of this speech, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
You said that providing, quote, less detail in the speech was better because the concept of a token morphing from a security to a non-security was a new concept and would generate a lot of discussion. Do I have that correct?
I believe so.
I see it was a deliberate policy preference. Does the current SEC chair share that view?
The determination whether any particular asset is a security is a facts and circumstances-based determination. And what I do as the director of FinHub with my staff is to provide the facts to the folks at the SEC who are making that determination. And it's typically going to be the Division of Corporation Finance.
Reclaiming my time, because that's a perfect segue. Has FinHub issued any guidance since Chair Gensler took office to clarify how the securities laws apply to crypto?
FinHub's role is really to be a subject matter expert. So
Reclaiming my time, ma'am. I'm asking a very specific question. Has FinHub issued any guidance?
FinHub typically gets involved with other divisions and offices at the agency.
Reclaiming my time. I take the answer is no, because it is no. Hinman announced that Ether was not a security, is not a security. Is that your view today?
I can't comment on any particular asset.
Right. You provided feedback on the speech, and so did Brett Redfern. Yet first the SEC argued in court that the speech was Hinman's own personal opinion. But why would people across the SEC, from FinHub to the Division of Trading and Markets, comment on a speech that has the views of only one person or only one division? That doesn't make any sense.
I hope you can appreciate that I can't comment on pending matters that are in litigation or investigation.
Okay, fair enough. The Southern District of New York even called the SEC's arguments hypocrisy. The court said SEC is adopting its litigation positions to further its desired goal and not out of faithful allegiance to the law. That's why it keeps losing in court. Does the chairman of the SEC tell you to adopt positions to further a specific goal, his own personal goal, rather than allegiance to the law?
Again, I can't comment on any matters that are pending in litigation, but I will say that
I do appreciate it. I reclaim my time. I think you answered the question.
Okay, so man, Emmer is all over them. I mean, he absolutely is not giving up. What are your position? Do you feel like we're going to get legislation or at least a little bit of a Band-Aid on the SEC overreach this round?
No, because we have an extreme, and I'm cheering for them, but extreme vocal minority that is making these points. Emmer, Davidson, Flood, McHenry, right? We know all of them. I would have loved to have seen Emmer become Speaker of the House. I think that would have been extremely impactful. And there was a moment there when it seemed like that was a realistic possibility. Yeah. But yeah, listen, I think that this isn't an indictment of crypto policy. I think it's an indictment of our government. If you ask me if I think anything will get done in the next year, I would say no. Right? I mean, it's election season. Yep. Everybody's just trying to get reelected. They're worried about their jobs. Nobody really wants to pass any controversial legislation at this point. I think everybody's just kind of biding their time, getting their talking points. Listen, once again, Emmer, McHenry, these guys, they come out there so amazing with all this bluster. They poo-poo all over the SEC, but then we don't see any movement, right? And most notably, I think, is you don't see any fear in the eyes of the SEC people that are getting grilled, including Gensler himself, because his mandate comes from a higher power. It's not about him. It's about Elizabeth Warren and the Biden White House, obviously. And until it becomes so politically unpopular to take the stance that he does, or until they tell him to change his mandate, it's very clear he doesn't care what anyone says. He doesn't care about public opinion. He's going to do exactly what he's going to do about crypto and everything else, for that matter, right? That's not unique to crypto. So I think we could get some very basic stablecoin legislation potentially before we get to a presidential election, but that's about it. I don't think we're going to see these market structure bills passed. I talk to guys at the Blockchain Association all the time. They're not optimistic that any of this is going to happen. We even saw these bills pass through committee. They don't even get brought to the floor of Congress, and Congress is Republican. Right. And imagine that passing Congress, we're going to get through the Senate and the White House to get any of this legislation passed into law. I just don't see it. I think that our government is too fundamentally broken. That said, it's amazing that we have these people on our side, that they've made it a major talking point, that they truly do care about it. And more importantly, they actually understand it, right? And they're out there willing to sort of bang heads with the regulators. But listen, the SEC is going to continue to regulate through enforcement. They've crushed a number of coins, at least temporarily, a number of platforms. They basically outright killed Binance US without ever proving a single thing, just by making accusations, getting their bank access cut off, making retail run away because they were scared. And in the end, we don't even know if they did anything wrong as a platform, So it seems that going back to what we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of people in crypto that are getting killed without due process, or basically the SEC opens their mouth and your coin goes down 30%. Is that protecting consumer? Or is that hurting them? There's Americans that own all of these things that Gary Gensler has a vendetta against, and he's doing nothing to protect those people. He's literally just hurting the value of their investments, And so I think that it has become wildly unpopular. I think it's very encouraging to see the justice system continually dunk all over the SEC, but I just don't see the SEC changing as a result of it. They're just going to keep doing what they're doing, take their bruises and move on.
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously now we're dealing with courts that are starting to kind of get fed up with it. But at the same time, I just feel like this is a huge embarrassment to Congress and the general, public that is starting to understand it, and the exposure that may come in a true presidential race where crypto most likely will start to be on the debate stage. And that in itself could open up some very intriguing elements. Obviously, we'll see this in the presidential landscape as it comes up in the next few months. I think the Republican, the DNC is in Chicago, I think in March or something. So it could happen fairly quickly, for sure. Hey, Scott, it's always fun having you on. Thank you so much. If you guys want to check out Mr. Scott Melker, go over to his YouTube channel, and that's over at Scott Melker, the Wolf of All Streets podcast, for sure. It's a dope miss. So again, thanks for stopping in. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Paul. Always an honor, man. I told you, we got to get you on our channels, man. We've had you on Spaces a couple times, so we got to do it more. Thank you.
Anytime. All right, you guys are tuned in, maybe over on our podcast. Jump over here to the YouTube channel. Get subscribed right now. Make sure to like a couple of videos. It's going to get it in your algorithm. You're going to start learning a little bit more about blockchain, Bitcoin, crypto, Web3, all that stuff that really is the innovation of technology. So hopefully this is a place, or one of the places that you go to for your best alpha. Of course, if you're not in our Diamond Circle, get in now. It's a free newsletter that we do, but it's also a couple of podcasts that we do over there as well that do not make it here on YouTube. So it's a great place to get additional content. And of course, if you guys want to get me out there on X, it's just @PaulBaron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.